Today, I'm coming out of the prayer closet to confess. I speak in tongues. I am David Servant. This is HeavenWord TV. It is so good to be back together once again as we continue our chronological study through the entire New Testament, and we have launched our journey now through the book of Acts. This is going to take us a long time because, as I have told you in the past, this is a chronological study through the New Testament, and so we're going to be breaking up the book of Acts with the epistles. Get ready for a nice long journey. By the time we finish Acts, we'll be finished with a good part of the entire New Testament because we'll have covered the epistles as well. So we're in Acts chapter 1. We're looking at a guy named Peter who plays certainly a central role, at least in the initial chapters of the book of Acts. And we see him rising up to a position of leadership right from the outset. He calls this meeting together, as it were, to decide who should replace Judas. I'm always a little bit suspicious of those who find fault with Peter in this case, although I understand their reasonings. Peter did mess up a lot of times in the Gospels. He's always sticking his foot in his mouth, and even right up to the end. I mean, it was just a few weeks earlier than this when Peter was claiming he would never deny the Lord, that he would be willing to go to death for him, but then denying the Lord 3 times. But some weeks have transpired, and all those problems have been worked out, and Peter has good reason to find a replacement for Judas because he's got scriptural warrant for it. And we've talked about this last time. Peter quotes to the crowd of 120 from 2 Psalms, Psalm 69, Psalm 109. One of those says, "Let his office another man take." Peter had been enlightened by Jesus regarding all the scriptures in the Old Testament that were messianic, that made reference to Jesus and his work and his death on the cross and his resurrection. And so Peter's really keen on, Old Testament prophetic scriptures, messianic scriptures. In fact, when we keep reading here into chapter 2, Peter's going to be quoting from some additional Psalms relating them to Jesus. And I can't believe he just got this stuff on his own. No, this was fresh revelation from Jesus as Jesus, either supernaturally enlightened the minds of the apostles or took them verse by verse through relevant scriptures in the Psalms and the prophets and in the law and so forth concerning himself. All right, so that being said, I'm not in that category of people who says that Peter was acting in the flesh when he decided to try to find a replacement for Judas. So we left off last time in around verse number 23. They had certain requirements. This man had to be someone who accompanied them the entire time from the preaching of John the Baptist right up until Jesus' death and so forth. And so they put forward 2 men, verse number 23, Joseph called Barsabbas, who was called Justus, and Matthias. And they prayed and said, quote, "You, Lord, you who know the hearts of all men, show us which one of these 2 you have chosen." So apparently they were able to narrow it down themselves by the criteria they had set to 2 men, but they didn't know who God's choice would be, and so they decided to draw lots. That's found in verse number 26. And they drew lots for them, and the lot fell to Matthias, and he was added to the 11 apostles. So there you have Matthias now as one of the 12. Now, I've heard people say, I heard this in my Bible school that I attended, well, you never hear about Matthias ever again. That's just one more proof this was just in the flesh. God didn't choose him. He was chosen by man. If you're chosen by man, you don't have any fruit. Well, we could say that about other apostles. One that I just checked out before we began recording here was Bartholomew. He's an easy one to look up, an odd name. No one else has his name. And you can read about Bartholomew being one of the 12 and mentioned in the Gospels, but even mentioned here in the book of Acts up until this time, but you never read about Bartholomew ever again. So does that prove he was chosen by man? No, he was chosen by Jesus Christ. Okay, so let's not jump to conclusions. I mean, just as John wrote, if everything that Jesus did was recorded, the world itself couldn't contain the books. Probably the same thing is true about those 12 men right there. We have some traditions, some history that tell us different places where they traveled and ministered and things that they did as they spread the gospel and established the church, but not much of it's recorded in the book of Acts, and so we're going to have to wait till we get to heaven, I suppose, to get all those wonderful details. I can't imagine that Matthias didn't do a lot for the Lord, but it's just hidden in history. Well, we come now. Oh, one other thing I need to say. It's often said that this is the last time you ever find anyone drawing lots to determine God's will. I can't think of any time where it actually happened in the Old Testament, but yet I don't want to make a statement based upon my poor memory. In fact, very well may have been times when God's will was determined by drawing lots. But it's said by some that this is the last time you see it, and the reason you see it here is because these men didn't have the Holy Spirit yet, but after the day of Pentecost, when the Holy Spirit fell upon them, no more instances of drawing lots. And I guess I would just add to that I would be very cautious in myself trying to determine God's will by throwing dice, or by drawing straws and say, well, Lord, show us. I have some Amish friends who actually, that's how they choose their pastors from amongst their Amish community. They draw lots, or they have some kind of method where people pull something out of a Bible or something, and when the lot falls to a certain guy, he's God's choice. He's the pastor. And then they tell me everybody weeps because they feel so sorry for him because nobody wants that job. So I guess when nobody wants it, that's the only way you're going to get somebody is by drawing lots because nobody feels called. Have to question that too. Okay, so a lot of interesting things about us Christians and how we determine God's will. I think it's always best to go to the Bible, find out God's general will. Then the next thing to do after you got his general will is just seek him in prayer and do your best to listen to the Holy Spirit. Many different things that you can check in to make sure that you're in the Lord's will, but you got to have that green light on the inside where the Holy Spirit dwells, the peace of God that's leading and guiding you. Okay? Well, we're going to get into the juicy stuff next, into Acts chapter 2, the day of Pentecost. I love it. Be right back. Alrighty, welcome back. We are in the book of Acts, about to jump into Acts chapter 2 and read about the day of Pentecost when the Holy Spirit came. However, last time I was touching on the subject of guidance from God. The apostles narrowed down the replacement for Judas to 2 guys, and then they cast lots drew lots to determine who God had chosen. And we talked about that's a valid way to determine God's will. Well, I have to believe it was valid for them, I have to believe it worked for them. But would I do that? I don't think so. Now, how do you find God's will specifically for your life? Well, I've said this before. I'm going to say it again. It's worth repeating. Find God's general will and obey that first. You have no right, and I have no right, seeking God for a specific will for my life when I'm ignoring his general will for everybody, right? Got it? Got it? Good. Okay. So once you feel like you're at that place where, you're committed to the general will of God that's revealed for all of us, you're trying to obey his commandments. I didn't say you're perfect. But you're striving to obey his commandments and so forth. And if you do mess up, you're, repenting and asking for the Lord's forgiveness. Well, then you could begin to seek him for his specific will for your life. I don't really believe that God is telling us what kind of clothes to wear every day. I think he's telling us generally that we should be modest. That's a biblical principle. But I don't wake up every morning and ask the Lord, what shirt do you want me to wear today? Or even, what do you want me to have for breakfast? Now, I'm saying that because I run into people who seem like they are asking God about every little detail, and God tells them every little detail. Okay, well, that's just not me, and I'm not real convinced that God is telling them those things. I'm not one of those people who believes that God is speaking to me every night by dreams. If I thought there was a message in most of my dreams from God, I would have to conclude that God is out of his mind, because many of my dreams are the craziest things when I remember them, that is. And, everybody dreams, scientists tell us, and dreams come from somewhere in your brain or your subconscious. They're not all from God. And when someone has a dream, this a wild dream, and then they go searching for an interpretation from all their friends. What do you think the Lord's saying to me in this? If you don't have the interpretation figured out, if God doesn't give it to you, pretty fast, I would doubt very seriously that dream is from God. So how do you determine God's will? I would suggest just taking time and praying and waiting on the Lord, as the Bible talks about, and doing your best not to listen for audible voices, because that can get you into danger, but just to wait until you feel like you have peace. If you're about to make a certain move that has has consequences that could last a long time, then pray about it until you have the peace that surpasses all comprehension. All right? That's the best that I can say. And yes, God does sometimes lead us through prophecy, but even in the biblical examples, and we'll see some of these in the book of Acts, prophecy served as a confirmation to what certain people already knew God was leading them through the witness of the Holy Spirit in their own hearts. Okay? Another thing you can go by is, if God's leading you to do something, is he providing the way? If he's guiding, he provides, and he also equips. If God's calling you to be a pastor or a teacher or an evangelist or a missionary, he's going to provide what you need. He's going to equip you with the gifts that you need, okay? Because it's his doing. So don't try to call yourself, don't try to make yourself something that you aren't. And if you're called to be a pastor, don't try to be an evangelist. If you're called to be an evangelist, don't try to be a pastor. Take it from me. Okay, I'm a guy that has struggled over decades at times trying to figure out exactly what God's will was for my life. Finally, after many years, I'm pretty well convinced that I've gotten into the niche that God had prepared for me, and I think perhaps that he used all those things along the way in various ministries. Even when I was a pastor, wondering if I was called to be a pastor, God ultimately used that, to prepare me for what I'm doing today. In fact, I can, share with you lots from the Word that I studied, 10, 20, and even 30 years ago. Okay, so it's all working together for good. God's in the redemption business, and he is good. All right, so enough said. We're going to just get in the edge of Acts chapter 2, starting now in verse number 1. When the day of Pentecost had come, Pentecost, Feast of the Jews, first fruits, first part of the harvest, 50 days approximately after Passover and the Feast of Unleavened Bread, which immediately follows the Passover for 7 days. Penta, 5. So just think 50 days, that's where it apparently got its name. The day of Pentecost had come, they were all together in one place. Now, not only were this group of the apostles, the 12, and apparently others all in one place, this happened in Jerusalem. Keep in mind that Pentecost was one of the 3 annual feasts at which all Jewish males were required to do a pilgrimage, to come to Jerusalem if they didn't already live there. And so God gathered a huge crowd once again, not just like he did for the crucifixion of Jesus. Now he is gathering a huge crowd once again for the birth of his church and the baptism in the Holy Spirit of his first disciples. They were gathered there not just from Judea and Samaria, but as we'll see as we read this, from really all over the Middle East and even North Africa and Turkey and Iran and so forth. And it was a marvelous gathering. So it's all strategically set up for the gospel to go out. God's doing a big thing now on the day of Pentecost in Jerusalem. Verse number 2. And suddenly there came from heaven a noise like a violent rushing wind, and it filled the whole house where they were sitting. So just imagine that in your mind. I always imagine like a jet engine. I mean, a violent rushing wind. You've ever heard one of those, a big storm outside your house, or, went through a hurricane or something. That's what it sounds like, but it's inside, but it's also heard from the outside because people gather. And there appeared to them tongues as of fire, distributing themselves as they rested on each one of them. Okay, so rats, we're out of time. We'll talk about those tongues of fire next time. I'll be right back. Okay, welcome back to Acts chapter 2, the day of Pentecost in Jerusalem, the birthing of the Church of Jesus Christ, which is still going on today by the power of the Holy Spirit. We ended up last time in verse number 3, which I read very quickly because we were running out of time. There appeared to them tongues as of fire, distributing themselves, and they rested on each one of them. The artists who draw this always have these little flames on top of people's heads and make them look like candlesticks, and I don't know, the flames rested on each one of them. It doesn't say on their head, so I don't know how we should actually picture this in our mind's eye. But more importantly, the visible manifestation of the fire was verse number 4, what was actually happening. And they were all filled with the Holy Spirit. Now, when we talk about the Holy Spirit, oftentimes and never speak of the Holy Spirit as it. I cringe when people say, the Holy Spirit. No, He, the Holy Spirit. He is God. He is part of the Trinity, just as much God as the Father is and as much the God Jesus is, okay? He, the Holy Spirit, is spoken of in liquid terms. That is, I will pour out my Spirit. And in this case, they were all filled with the Holy Spirit. In a quantitative sense, filled indicates prior to that filling, they were empty or low. Okay, but now they're filled with the Holy Spirit. And I just take that at face value. Wouldn't you always like to be filled with the Holy Spirit? I know we all believe that those who are born again have the Holy Spirit indwelling them. And I believe that these people at the day of Pentecost already had the Holy Spirit indwelling them. They had been born of the Spirit, but now something happens that's different than that. Maybe same Spirit, but different experience, not born of the Spirit, but yet filled with the Holy Spirit. Okay? And then what happens to them? And began to speak with other tongues as the Spirit was giving them utterance. And as we continue reading here, which we will do, it's obvious that they were speaking, as far as we can tell, known languages from the surrounding areas and regions and countries, and they were praising God in those languages. So this is supernatural. These guys don't know the languages they're speaking, and it's the Holy Spirit who's giving them the utterance. So that is miraculous. Now, I said to you in a previous time we got together, so many folks who identify with this experience, and they would be within the Protestant and even, I guess, the Catholic world, maybe more so at one time than today, the Pentecostals, or the newer group, the Charismatics. They were born started off in the 70s, whereas the Pentecostals got going, back at the turn of the century in the Azusa Street revival in Los Angeles. That was in 1900-something or other. Okay, so early on in the last century. And not only that, but many people within the traditional denominations, and of course just independent churches, by the hundreds of millions, would identify with this experience, being able to say, I also had something happen to me by the power of the Holy Spirit, and that was accompanied by my speaking in tongues. Okay, David Barrett, who is perhaps the late David Barrett, the foremost church statistician, I would say. Worked for the International Mission Board of the Southern Baptists for a number of years before his passing, but gathering all the statistics about all the Christian activity around the world. And it was him who said that the Pentecostal/Charismatics make up the largest distinct group of Protestants that exists in the world, okay? So this is not just a little tiny splinter group or a little tiny cult. Well, when you start traveling in Africa and Eastern Europe and Asia, you start running into the Pentecostals. It gets harder and harder to find just a straight-laced, non-tongue-speaking evangelical when you get out of the United States, okay? But a lot of folks watch this in the United States, and they watch it from Australia and New Zealand and so forth, so they maybe not quite so familiar with that. But let me confess, I'm going to come out of the closet and tell you that this happened to me. It was when I was just 17 or 18 years old. I visited a Pentecostal church. The pastor of that church on that Sunday evening that I visited invited people to come forward who wanted to be baptized in the Holy Spirit. I really had no idea what that was, but I wanted anything I could get from God. And so I walked forward. I was a shy kid at the time, but I walked forward, and I was the only person, and they took me in a back room, and to make a long story short, I'm going to tell you the longer version the next time we get together, but to make a long story short, within probably a half hour's time, I was speaking fluently, rapidly, in what I knew was an Oriental language that I had never learned. And I had no idea what I was saying, and I didn't have any idea what language it was. Now, and I'll tell you some of this next time, later on, I had someone identify my language as being Japanese. And on 3 occasions, people who had some actual knowledge of Japanese and who heard me speaking in tongues told me I was speaking Japanese, and they told me what I said in Japanese. And in each case, what I said Japanese certainly was in no contradiction with the Bible. A couple times it was, praising of God and thanking God. And so when people today tell me that this was only for the apostles and this all ceased after the book of Acts was completed, they get to me too late because it already happened to me. Okay, and I got lots and lots of friends who would have the same thing. Now, does that make me superior? Oh my goodness, no. Does that make me more holy? Oh, I can tell you, absolutely not. And this is a gift, okay? And I want to talk about that gift, how that gift relates to you. And if you're interested in speaking in tongues, I might just be able to help you receive that. Okay, all right, can't wait. See you next time.
Visit us online at HeavenWord.tv to view this and every episode of HeavenWord TV for free. Watch the behind-the-scenes videos. Read other teaching articles, books, and devotionals written by David Servant, and learn about other exciting ministries that David directs. All this and more is at HeavenWord.tv.